And welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Seth Anderson, and I'm the Software Preservation Program Manager at Yale University. Yale University is the host of the EaaSI program of work. I am filling in today as the host since Ethan, our usual webinar host, is participating today. So we are excited to hear from him and his work on configuration. So today we're presenting EaaSI configuration workflows, a roundtable discussion with Lauren Work, Zachary Firsty, and Ethan Gates. But just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in your Zoom control panel. And I will bring them up during the presentation, or we'll have some time for your questions at the end. Also, please mute yourself and turn off your video to maximize the quality of our recording. This webinar recording, as well as the recordings from all of the previous webinars, will be made available on the EaaSI website with transcripts as soon as possible. Now, let's introduce our guest speakers and members of the EaaSI network. So first we have Lauren Work, who is the Digital Preservation Librarian at the University of Virginia, where she is responsible for the implementation of preservation strategy and systems for university digital resources. She is also the project lead for the Fostering a Community of Practice, FCOP grant at UVA, the digital preservation strategist for UVA's EaaSI node, and a member of the SPIN research working group. Then we have Zachary Firsty from Carnegie Mellon University, who's received a PhD in film and visual studies from Harvard. As a clear postdoctoral fellow in software curation for the sciences and social sciences, he collaborates with faculty, staff, and students to develop strategies for preserving and curating executable archival materials such as research software, digital scholarship, and code-based artworks. He plays a key role in developing software preservation and curation workflows, policies, and strategies in the university's libraries. Previously, Firsty held a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in digital humanities at the University of South Carolina, California. Ethan Gates is our software preservation analyst at Yale University Library, where he coordinates the creation and documentation of emulated computing environments for the EaaSI network, as well as the development of training materials. Sorry, I'm just going to mute a couple lines here. Where was I? As well, Ethan leads the creation and documentation of emulated computing environments for the EaaSI network, as well as the development of training materials for EaaSI users and the digital preservation community. Ethan is a graduate of NYU's master's program in moving image archiving and preservation, and has worked with organizations including Metro Transfer Collective and the Association of Moving Image Archivists Open Source Committee to develop workshops and resources that demystify digital technology for archivists. So without further ado, it gives me pleasure to hand it over to Ethan for an overview of EaaSI configuration workflows that we've implemented here at Yale University.
Wonderful, thanks, Seth. And I'm just going to hand it. Can you all see slides at this point?
Yes.
Someone for that. Thank you very much, Seth. Great. So as Seth says, I'm going to, as we have been doing with all these webinars, give an overview of the topic from the EaaSI staff perspective. So today, since we're talking about configuration workflows and basically actually filling the EaaSI network with content, with emulated environments and how we do that, I'm just basically going to go over what the workflow looks like here at Yale University Library, the host for the EaaSI program, to give an idea of how we're using Yale's legacy software collections and moving them from into the EaaSI network and what that process looks like. So just to sort of give an overview, there's a foundational principle here of the emulation as a service platform and the EaaSI program of work in the reduction of variability and redundancy. When we're creating emulated computing environments for the EaaSI network, it's really important for us to start from a base of well-known, well-described, stable environments that are going to be broadly applicable across many domains and user communities. If we start from that point, in our creation of emulated environments, the way that the derivative system in the emulation as a service platform works, that allows EaaSI users to then go off and craft their more specific custom environments according to their needs and their software collections, without everyone needing to start from scratch of putting together hardware settings and installing an operating system every single time that they need emulation for an access purpose. What that looks like in practice is to first create environments based essentially on major operating system releases. When we're sort of like looking back through the whole history of software and of computing systems, we have to narrow it down to, okay, what are we actually going to target? What are we actually going to put into the system? Where do we start from? So you can see some of the work it's took to start charting out, not just say what major operating system releases to target, but even possibly appropriate updates and hardware settings to match up with those releases when we consider, okay, what is even a base environment? Where do we want to start from? So in the case of, say, Windows 95, for instance, later updates or service packs for that operating system might be actually a higher target than the initial release because they allowed for USB support or bigger hard drive sizes, features that give us more flexibility down the line in installing more software or adding collection content to a more broadly applicable range of cases. Excuse me, just struggling with my Google a little bit. Meanwhile, there's parallel work on prioritization that has to get done in Yale's collection of legacy software for, okay, once we have those base operating systems, those base environments in place, what's the next step? What are the actual applications that we want to start loading an environment that will be of use to a number of users right off the bat? It's a little hard to pull data on the number of like unique titles in Yale's software collection, but there's, I mean, we can certainly say tens of thousands of applications that are available for us to start working with. Again, you know, one of the reasons we're starting this work hosting at Yale. So where given this perhaps, you know, giant CSV, giant list of applications that you can start with, covering tens of thousands of applications from the personal computing era, from the late 80s up through the 2010s. Where do you start with that? So we had to do some prioritization work, first through a public survey that we put out in February, which was based on basically like what are the sort of popular software genres that we could work in that people would be interested in seeing EaaSI working with. That returned mostly some predictable results, I would say, given the software preservation network and digital preservation community it was marketed to. So a lot of interest in CAD, architectural software, office productivity, etc. Web archiving is clearly on everyone's mind because there was a lot of interest in web browsers. But also the prioritization work here also came out of a lot of internal conversations about what applications would be useful for the other areas of EaaSI's program of work. So generating sample data for the metadata model that Seth described last month, or for the work that Kat is doing with Wikidata and WikiDP, what would be data that, or applications that we should work with that would help prove the use case for what EaaSI is doing. The Universal Virtual Interactor, the API work being done by Klaus and Oleg and Ewan on taking a file and matching it up with file format capabilities of software and providing recommendations for emulated environments. What would, again, provide good demonstrations or use cases to prove the value of that work? And then also, of course, we're always open to requests from the nodes that we're working with or internal stakeholders at Yale in terms of just like what are individual applications that we should move forward with. In terms of actually taking all of this priority and target work and applying it to configuration, I handle most of the base creation, that is like the work of those foundational operating system releases, places of starting work. And I do this mostly outside actually of emulation as a service, outside of the EaaSI platform in local versions of QEMU or the other relevant underlying emulators. Just for right now, while there is ongoing development work in the back end and the front end of the EaaSI platform, while we're essentially in the beta released still of the network, because working locally allows me to do some more thorough troubleshooting and documentation. These are environments that I know need to be stable, and I need to just know their features and their configuration back and front, so that when I'm helping other users at other nodes to troubleshoot environments, I can say very confidently what is perhaps inherent to the disk image or inherent to that environment and what is not. So every base environment that I go through is subjected to a checklist of certain baseline guaranteed features to match up with the EaaS platform. That includes TCP/IP networking capability, PostScript printing, CD-ROM drivers if appropriate, exceptions always made if it's not appropriate, given the timeline of that operating system, of course. But at the end, each base is created and packaged up and backed up locally here at Yale with screenshots of the installation process, so that at any point later on in our EaaSI platform development, as that work is ongoing, we can always return to these stable disk images no matter what and reset if necessary. On the software front, items are then individual software applications are either uploaded manually through the EaaSI demo administration UI, as you can see here, which is generally for more one-off cases or boutique needs. Like, oh, are you not seeing my slides advancing, Seth?
No.
Not at all? Are we still stuck on?
Yeah, you're on slide 1 still.
Still on slide 1?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's sooner.
Sorry. That is a problem. Sorry, folks. How about now? Do you see slide movement or advancement?
Yes.
Yeah, that's working.
Moving around?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I didn't realize that you weren't seeing any of that work. So here's some of the base environment creation spreadsheets. Here's our legacy software collection sorting through those thousands of applications that I mentioned. Here's an idea of the base configuration work that I do locally in terms of making notes, going through checklists, packaging up disk images. And this brings us back to upload of individual software applications into the EaaSI platform demonstration UI. Again, this is for more one-off boutique needs. So this might be like crafting together the exact stack file requirements to recreate, say, a mid-2000s Archivist toolkit instance with MySQL, XAMPP, a demonstration SQL database. Or for the bulk of our configuration work, we actually use a Python script that was written by one of our student employees here at Yale to take existing metadata from the legacy software collection and turn it into EaaSI METS XML records that will actually make that item usable on the EaaSI backend. So this allows us to batch import dozens of items potentially at a time that I can then hand off to that team of student workers for catalog and configuration. So again, this is the point at which I actually hand off to our student employees the work of looking at I do the work of actually handing off the cataloging of items to our student employees, which varies from semester to semester, the size of our team. At times we've had 2 employees, like over the summer. At times we have 9 coming in and out. I'd say during the year, the academic year, we basically get the equivalent of one full-time employee altogether out of their hours. But they basically work in spreadsheets using the metadata model that Seth, again, described in more detail last month for the kind of information that we're looking up for about these applications to drive our system, and capturing as much of that information as possible about each item. That includes release dates for applications, operating system requirements, language settings, file format capabilities, all of those. Each column here is going to drive some piece of functionality in the EaaSI platform ultimately, whether it's discoverability in the new browse and search interfaces of the UI work that's being done by Portal Media, or it might drive recommendations crafted by the Universal Virtual Interactor. So again, each one of these has a purpose, will get mapped into our database and into our system. Gathering this information just takes a lot of back and forth between that spreadsheet you were just seeing and running the title in emulation on the EaaSI platform. So for our student workers, this takes a lot of time, not just learning our platform, which they've certainly never seen before, but just how to interact with legacy computing environments that, again, given we're talking about frequently undergraduate college students, legacy operating systems and environments and applications that they've probably never encountered before. There's also a lot of variability in that information in that spreadsheet where they might find that. While there have certainly been certain patterns in the history of software design, publish date or manufacturer listed on an about page, there's no guarantee from one item to the next that that's going to be in the same place or even present at all. So it takes a lot of flexibility and curiosity, critical thinking, really to get to the level of that thorough documentation that we're asking for. And I know I want to get to our discussion and not take up too much of our time here, but so just quickly summarizing the challenges of this configuration workflow, that training is an issue, especially with student turnover from one semester to the next. How do you very quickly get students who may not have had a lot of experience cataloging or with using legacy software to understand what we're doing and how to do it quickly? There's a constant balance in that prioritization work and configuration between sort of balancing bulk and boutique work between how do we upload and create a lot of environments that are useful to a lot of people while also addressing specific use cases and very, very custom code or extremely far down the line in terms of like lots of system requirements and very specific version application requirements. There's some challenge in quality assurance and control. I mean, just both between our platform and some of the technical limitations during the beta and otherwise in terms of just like, what does it mean to say that an environment is configured or has been cataloged and should be published now to the network. It's easy to say that an environment is created and done when a software application is installed, but does that mean that every single feature contained within that application works? And is there a way we can test that? There's a lot of exploration still to be done in making that aspect of our work more efficient. And then I'd say there's going to be troubles with advanced configuration. The EaaS platform bundles together a lot of underlying open source emulators. And while the vast majority of software and use cases that we're working with currently are covered by a very small number of emulators and template settings for those emulators, I'd say 90 to 95% of our work so far has been Intel compatible PC emulation offered by QEMU. The further we go and the further we look into not just creating these environments, but optimizing them for particular use cases. So, when we're not just talking about cranking out every version of Microsoft Office ever, but really looking at custom code written for the Amiga by an artist in an interactive exhibition in a gallery, the more we look at EaaSI for those kinds of very particular access cases, the more it's going to require learning not just how EaaSI works and moving pieces together on the EaaSI platform, but how these underlying emulators work and how to troubleshoot between those different layers of the emulator code, our code, the legacy code, and figure out what the best possible experience is for a curator or a researcher or a patron. So that's my summary. I apologize for the slight glitch in the slides there, and I'm sure we'll make these available later on. But I want to wrap this up now so we can start hearing from configuration work at the nodes as well, and hear how this is going there.
Thank you, Ethan. That was great. And yes, we will, I'm sure, post the slides along with the transcript so you can get a closer glimpse at all of the spreadsheets that Ethan has been putting together over the last year. So yeah, as someone said earlier this week at a conference, it's turtles all the way down for software emulation. So yeah, layers upon layers of complexity. And with that, we will now transition to our guest speakers and dive into a discussion. So Zach and Lauren, hope you're ready. All right. And just a reminder, if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I'm going to just alert everyone to where that is by sending a message now. All right, so on to moderated discussion with Ethan and Lauren and Zach, and hopefully this will ground the overview in the practice and context of other institutions besides Yale. So first, Lauren, can you maybe give us some background on what your previous experience in using emulation software was prior to EaaSI or FCOP? And were there any emulation programs that you had already incorporated into your institutional workflows, which predate EaaSI?
Sure, and I apologize if my connection is a little wonky. I may have to turn off the video. I'm at home, so apologies ahead of time for that. But yeah, to answer your question, maybe this is heartening to folks on the call, but I actually didn't have a ton of emulation experience. I'm a digital preservation librarian. My role covers a lot of things, and I think like a lot of folks, I had messed around with emulation a little bit in courses, both in school and then in my role at UVA. I was fortunate enough to take some things. So I messed around with things like Sheep Shaver, but never really had a problem set distinct enough to say I need to get this implemented and running on my own. So it's something that I had some experience with, but not a lot prior to something like EaaSI, which made it a lot easier to scale and test without having to necessarily build things out on my own, which was great. Or support things on my own, or even with devs, with things like UVA. And I know that's been a significant factor moving forward. And as far as emulation programs incorporated into institutional workflows, we hadn't had anything yet. So there's some small things like using Amazon app streams for things like Aeon, if any other folks are using that. But other than that, we haven't really implemented things at scale. So that's to start, and I'll throw things over to Zach, who may have a very different experience with this, but I'll do that.
Yeah, Zach, what was your previous experience with emulation prior to starting work on EaaSI?
It was actually pretty similar to Lauren in the sense that I didn't have any really formal context in which to use emulation, but I had, as kind of an inveterate tinkerer and sort of techno explorer, I had certainly booted up virtual machines many times before, and kind of toyed around. Often it was, oh, hey, there's this Windows program and I only have a Mac ready. How could I run a Windows on my Mac? And something that I was thinking about a little bit in preparation for this discussion was that thinking back on these experiences, there was a severe limit, because I remember I've started a lot of virtual machines, but they end up taking up so much of my hard drive, so much of my resources, that it's not the kind of thing that, during the triage of, oh no, I need to free up some space on the hard drive, that big, 40 gigabytes of Windows XP is going to be the first one to go. So, I mean, that's certainly a way in which I was really excited to learn about EaaSI, and I think one way that offers a lot to people that do want to work with emulation. And in terms of just very quickly, the emulation workflows at the institution, at Carnegie Mellon, I'm not aware of any other at the libraries at least, any other use of emulation outside of EaaSI. There's some work with containerization and some new projects using Docker to containerize scholarly work and digital projects, but not emulation per se.
Right. I would point out before I move on to the next question, so Carnegie Mellon's in an interesting and I think a unique position in that they have previously attempted a system similar to EaaSI, so the Olive project, which has been dormant for a little while, but I know that has at least informed, I think, the continuing development of emulation services at Carnegie Mellon that EaaSI is now sort of the basis for.
Yeah, that's right. So it's, I guess, useful to note on an institutional level that that's a project really run, or it was, Olive was something run by a couple of one computer science professor in particular. And so I think a lot of the work of EaaSI and bringing that to the wider campus has been figuring out that interface between the library and the School of Computer Science, especially with that history.
Great, thank you. So Lauren or Zach, so I know Ethan mentioned that we have many student workers who are creating environments here. We have yet to see too much activity from other users, but we haven't really opened up the ability to configure environments too much. But have you seen other users in your node, whether that's library staff or anyone really at the university who have created environments and let us know, what did they create, what challenges may they have faced, and did you actually spend any time working with them on that?
I'll go ahead and go first again if that's okay, Zach, because my answer is pretty short. So at our node at UVA currently, it's myself and Christian Dahlhausen, who's our node developer, who's done a lot of the work on actually setting up EaaSI, who have mostly worked in creating environments. So we haven't really done a lot of testing yet with other users. However, through our kind of dual work on the FCOP project, we've had a lot of folks kind of starting to work within the environment. And so this is with some preloaded, things that I've loaded in, setting up environments, putting software in particular operating, environments and things like that. So we have had people start to even get used to the environment, understand how the menu navigation, and those things work. I think that's an important kind of grounding concept to all this, as well as the introduction to how emulation works. And we've been working on that as well at UVA through as many kind of outreach things as possible. But in short, nothing really to report yet in terms of like setting up and creating environments, but I do have some comments for kind of all the work that goes into preparing everything that will go into an environment. And I can talk about that a little bit, but for right now, not a lot to report yet on things like, the computing concepts, but things like the interface that has taken some explanation. And I have to say, like, the documentation that you all have created, we've been leveraging that. So that's a really good resource to kind of highlight to folks on the call, and also use that to help build out our internal workflows for things that may be different for environments we're creating, as well as really thinking through. So we're working with some particular software right now for the FCOP project that is a CAD BIM software that is nuanced like a lot of things, and really thinking through what we're including in environments to allow people to use those more easily. So whether that's a README about the nuances of some of the work that's done, I'm sure you all have already really thought closely about these things, but all of those kind of granular things that come up as you actually start working in the environment, and how you could better leverage and scale people's understandings who aren't going to come to all these environments with any inherent knowledge, like even if they've been working, in computers for a while. So I'll leave it at that for now and toss it over to Zach.
Well, I'll follow up really quick before we turn it over to Zach, but I'm wondering, since you've been one of the primary users at UVA, I mean, what have you found was the biggest surprise or challenge? What's something that, you didn't expect to have to learn, or, what skills did you need to improve?
Yeah. I think something that Ethan kind of highlighted a little bit, so not necessarily anything within the environment, and I think that speaks to how well Klaus and you all have done to make it usable and functionable and have documentation, but some of the things around licensing and dependencies for software. So getting license keys, getting software running, making sure that those dependencies are well known ahead of time. That was something for me that was new. And you had mentioned earlier folks being interested in things like web archiving. I'm really interested around the roles of documentation for software. So the example that we have right now that we're working on is a commercial software. There's a ton of user boards and things like that online that actually it helped me navigate through understanding how to actually get some things to run. And I see Ethan, nodding here. So that's something that I've been thinking about. We also have a web archiving program here, just trying to connect all these dots between how do we actually understand how to obviously technically make things run, but to have users really understand how to make and use the projects and collections we're taking all this effort for, and understand how to use them in the future. That's something for me that kind of was elevated in this whole process.
Great, thank you. Zach, just a reminder, so the question was, are there other users at your node or at the institution who are creating environments? And if you have any experience that you can share or feedback that they've provided as far as challenges or skills that they've had to learn, I'm curious to hear about those.
Sure. So similarly to Lauren, while we don't have other users creating environments, what we do have, and it just really began this week actually, is there's a group in the computational design at the College of Fine Arts at Carnegie Mellon that is doing a course on the history of computer-aided design. And so we've been working with a professor in the School of Architecture there to get a bunch of old CAD environments basically up and running and easy. And so this week on Monday, I'm hopefully going to be hearing back tomorrow on a call about the experience that the students had poking around in EaaSI. We let them log right in and open up the different environments. There are some in Windows 98, Windows XP, Windows 3.1, DOS. So it should be really interesting to hear from the perspective. I would also say that I kind of just joined a couple of months ago, so in some ways I'm jumping into the EaaSI workflow, and so kind of personally reflecting about sort of the biggest kind of learning curves, and also as I explain what EaaSI is to faculty and other collaborators. I do think this terminology, what's so interesting about EaaSI, the turtles all the way down, the kind of emulation stacked on virtual machine on an instance on a server. I think this kind of slippage of terms when we talk about the server that runs, the instances that have containers that contain virtual machines that you can spin environments out of, can be a bit dizzying. And I think it's easy to say the wrong thing, to talk about an instance, or a server when you mean the emulation. And so just kind of clarifying some of that thing. And I would second Lauren's kudos on the documentation, which does have some very useful graphics about this, and kind of breaking it down. And I'm not sure really what kind of feedback this is. I think it's really inherent to the issue of emulation. And so it's not necessarily something that we need to work on, but that has been, I would say, a big bit of work is breaking down those different interrelated and kind of nested concepts that are invoked by EaaSI.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead, Ethan.
I'm wondering if I can, jump in at this point, because both of what you're talking about is bringing up, a question I think that that I get a lot, which is that question of training and how do you get students to wrap their heads around these concepts and like what resources are most useful. And we're still sort of figuring that out because I think as both Lauren and Zach, you point to, there's just this dizzying amount of possible information to wrap your head around. I mean, both in terms of using emulators and all of these possible applications. I mean, people are surprised that I often, a lot of this just boils down to internet searching, as Lauren sort of pointed out. And I think that's the web archiving and how we bring in and consolidate all of that documentation that does exist out there, and that would be really exhausting to recreate ourselves. How we can leverage what already exists is really interesting. But I guess I'm interested in hearing from both Zach and Lauren, like, are there any particular places that you go to off the bat, for sort of explaining EaaSI and emulation to first-time users?
Well, I'll say that my experience has been talking about emulation, the first reference point that many people have, and it was probably the first way that I really thought about it too, is emulating old gaming systems. And there's something about that is a really useful kind of heuristic to say, oh yeah, you know how you can run that Super NES on whatever on your computer or something like that. And it helps people kind of think about, oh, so you're kind of virtually assembling the component parts of that legacy system. And that's what you do. And I think that's pretty easily extrapolated. And so I would say that as kind of an example to explain what's going on. And then, I mean, there really are, like we're all saying, these tremendous resources, these kind of hobbyist communities about emulation and legacy systems. And there are various boards. I've been recently spending a lot of time in the world of Emulation, which is the emulation of old Macintosh environments, which has a really kind of robust community instead of documentation and stuff like that. And there are many others. Sometimes I've noticed the trick can be actually the search term indexing. Like, Google does not believe that you are really searching for a certain Windows 95 driver. There's no way. You must be looking for Windows 7, and so that's kind of an interesting, secondary feature that you have to kind of fight against search engine optimization sometimes to work with this legacy stuff.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, I do notice that. You often get indexed support sites from the developers that are actually just get 404s when you actually click through. So it's always an interesting.
Well, then you go to the Wayback Machine,
right? Well,
on the Internet Archive, and you see if that manual or that help page from 2004 ended up in there. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't, but also, yeah, that is an interesting thing of could we borrow off some of that work that's been done to, again, it exists, but can we bring it together, and how do we present it to a user in a useful way, to Lauren's point?
Yeah. So moving along, as it's about time to open it up to audience Q&A, and maybe these are short answers given, that we're still early in rolling out the service and everything. But Zach or Lauren, so how formal at this point are your workflows for configuration? Have you started documenting any of this work, creating manuals, putting together guidelines, etc.?
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to highlight, just kind of going back to what Ethan was talking about at the very beginning, this idea of like well-known and well-described, that comes into kind of the workflows that we're establishing for, EaaSI, and that some of this right now has centered around some of our FCOP work. So one thing I wanted to say to folks, because I know there's a lot and people have questions, I was going to drop as part of the FCOP project that we did at UVA, we had a workshop where we pretty much published everything including some of our in-progress workflows in OSF. So I'm going to drop that in the chat so people can reference that if they want to, or if you've already, if you came and attended, hi again. But it was a great way to talk through some of the work that we're doing so far. So I just dropped it in the chat there. But one thing I wanted to highlight that I think folks have to think about, and the way that we've tried to start highlighting this infrastructurally, thinking about leveraging existing workflows, thinking about how people can understand emulation and actually understand how it may come into their day-to-day workflows across the library. So I'm in an academic institution. We've been using things like the best practice for fair use to do things like update our deed of gift, to do things like create checklists and questionnaires around soliciting questions and getting archivists to start asking questions about software and software-dependent materials. That's something that we have started to work into, workflows and how that actually is could go. And I wanted to highlight, I was reviewing the EaaSI documentation that you all had written up about, publishing and replicating resources. And you have great questions in here about like, what could or should you be publishing? Those questions should be answered like up the line. So we're really trying to get those configured into our workflows as soon as possible, because it's going to help everything in future. Same goes for digital preservation and processing workflows. Do we know what we have? One thing I wanted to highlight was that through this work, I connected with Nick Krabenhoft. I saw that we had a question from the folks at CCA about like things that have come up around CAD BIM software. Vectorworks, which is the name of the software that we're working with specifically right now as our one use case for FCOP, and it relates to EaaSI, is the fact that Pronom has some signatures, but not all. So again, this is an opportunity to take work that can benefit the community as a whole. Nick and I both have some of these file types in our collections, and there's some questions about what's being identified and how we can best have the signature be accurate. There's some distinctions in the header between identifications of file types in Vectorworks. Vectorworks was this thing that people use to migrate file formats. So sometimes there's two potential software versions that are highlighted there. So things like that, these granular things that come up way down the line that eventually will allow us to say, yes, render this, yes, contribute this to Wikidata to update this, contribute this, to the signature and Pronom so that everybody running it, whether it's an Archivematica or other ways that they're doing file format identification, can better and more accurately describe what you are trying to preserve and potentially emulate in the first place. So all of these things, again, that OSF link, we have things like a donor checklist for questions to even start asking people, do you have licenses? Do you have documentation and manuals for these things that you are potentially giving to us? Things like leveraging existing metadata. Again, our use case was commercial software. So we were like, let's write a very quick way of maybe if there's MARC metadata about this in the system, see if we want to transfer this into something we can leverage to start. Again, not using MARC, but leveraging existing work and data. And I think I'll cut it off there so we have time and that Zach can chip into, but that's where we are right now.
Thank you, yeah.
So about the documentation for workflows, it's been something that we've kind of been in the process of working through. We did have, we did draw up as a group, the four individuals within the libraries that have been working on the EaaSI project, had put together some documentation about imaging and importing, basically adding images to our collection so that they can be then added as software within EaaSI. And then we realized that we were having trouble actually using some of these images, and so had a big stack of a couple of dozen expert witness format, to get technical, files that contain the images of various disks, and then we weren't able to mount them. Something that I noticed was kind of these competing tensions where, as in my background as someone who's just often doing kind of a DIY sort of artistic project, I just want to hack something together that will work given the constraints of the current system. And so my first impulse is, oh, I'll just have to, write a script that converts these to a format that is accepted. But then stepping back a little bit and thinking about the broader project, I'm noticing that that's in tension a little bit with kind of building up kind of the robust systematic and spending that time maybe working on documentation and writing out the bug reporting, saying we expected this, and here's the steps that we went through, and here's the unexpected result. Yeah, so that is the note on documentation. I definitely second what Lauren was saying about kind of importing, or at least conceptually importing, existing workflows, existing concepts, whether they're metadata or other kinds of things, into the EaaSI project. And are we talking already about these the questions in the chat?
Sort of, it spilled over. Yeah, well, I think I want to come back, because I do want to focus on Stefano's question about CAD BIM in detail, since it's been a big use case for us. But before we do that, just really quickly, maybe we can get yes or no answers to this one. Have you thought about QC criteria yet? And Ethan, maybe you can fill this one in a little bit, and what are some of the methods you are thinking about at this point that you might pursue?
Thought about it quite a bit, but it is what guides that thinking a lot, is that it becomes, the QC criteria for each environment becomes so specific depending on what the intended use of that environment is, whether it is just broadly like this environment is just supposed to have Adobe Reader 4.0 in it, and that works. The QC criteria for it opens PDFs is relatively simple, but QC criteria for a more advanced CAD application or even something else might be much more complicated. So it had the thinking is, how do we scale that thinking at that moment, and like what are the platforms that would be necessary to allow for that variability in even establishing the criteria. So it's been interesting, because I think it has involved maybe stepping back again, as Zach was even just saying, like with the imaging workflows, from what I expected in terms of where we might be at, oh, it'd be easy to like with the base environment creation checklist, that was relatively easy because there are certain standard steady features that have to work with emulation as a service, that have to be offered by the operating system. They're known. It was not that difficult to come up with. But then that, again, thinking that could maybe step to software environments, it's had to actually be a step back to how do we build a system that allows for people to create their own criteria, basically, and for that to vary from one institution to the next, and one collection to the next, and one item to the next.
Right, and I think the challenge as well is to, be explicit about what the baseline is for quality control, because an application may work with whatever our control variable is. So a sample PDF file, for instance, that we might load in, but it may not work for somebody else's PDF, whether that's due to issues with the file or some specific dependency that we're not aware of. So, there are edge cases always that we can't deal with. So, yeah, as we continue.
And a lot of possible points of failure, to even Zach's point of, all these expert witness format disk images that everyone in the digital preservation community has been making because they offer great documentation for disk images. Guess what? Like, almost no emulators take those as input formats, and that's down to the underlying projects that we have to rely on. And so how do we think through that? Yeah. There's a lot of different points to have to work through.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, Lauren, Zach, and Ethan. So we're a little behind schedule, so we only have 10 minutes for audience questions, but hopefully we can get through the 2-3-ish that we have. So if anyone has any that have come up over the last discussion, please post them in the chat box now. But yeah, so Stefana asked, are you finding that there are any challenges particular to configuring environments that include CAD BIM software? Lauren, you touched on this a bit, but Zach, maybe since you've been working on this classroom project, has anything come up in particular that you've had troubles with?
Well, one very particular, as in specific thing, the licensing can be pretty tricky. So for example, Carnegie Mellon had a few old copies of ArchiCAD, an important architectural CAD software, but these required a hardware key, a little USB key to be plugged in, and those, of course, have slipped through the cracks of whatever department office that the CDs were in. And so that's one specific thing. It seems like when you have a stack of CDs, that's one thing, and they have a momentum and inertia that will keep those together. When you start adding dongles, it's just from my experience that starts becoming something that slips through the cracks. So that's one thing. I'll say, I've been rather impressed with how well these virtual machines are able to actually run this CAD software. I was pretty concerned. I mean, depending on the environment, obviously there are issues of just kind of cursor lag and things like that that make it less than optimal. But in terms of the actual rendering kind of throughput, I've been like surprised. And something that's been absolutely essential in this classroom project has been ensuring to bring in all the demos or samples. So not just install the base software, but make sure if there's another folder on that disk that has demos and samples, that's something that's able to kind of illustrate the utility and the history of these applications a lot better, especially for me. I don't know how to use CAD, so I can immediately make an interesting image appear by opening the spaceship or whatever in the CAD program.
Great, thank you. Ethan, I know you've...
I just, to echo on that, because we did have a concerted effort to get as much, we knew this request was coming down from Carnegie Mellon that they were going to be using this class. So I would say we did try to process as much as we could out of Yale's collection. And just to echo the problem with the licensing, we were either missing license keys, there were either like physical dongle devices that were missing, or I've sometimes with some versions of AutoCAD, especially in like the mid 2000s Windows XP era, we're getting to the point where we had the license key, we had a registration code, and we're just still missing an activation code. It was like 4 layers of licensing that you couldn't get to. And so that, you know, given some of the work that the Cyberlaw Clinic and Software Preservation Network have done with the DMCA exception, for cracking that software, we, you know, are confident enough that we could do that, you know, to circumvent those measures, but it just would take so much extra work for me to even learn how to do that, to even go find whatever the legacy piece of anti-circumvention like cracking software would be, find that, apply it, and then extra concerns with the DMCA exemption rather than the code of best practices for fair use, given the software that is circumvented has like possibly some more restrictions on what we can publish, what we can give access to than any other items. Yeah, the licensing is obviously not as much of a problem as it was even a year or two ago before the publishing of the code, but it's still an issue.
Yeah, and that's a good point, just to direct everyone once the recording is posted, just to remind you all that we did have a session on legal and policy issues related to emulation a couple months ago, so there's more information on that, of course, out there.
Yeah, I should have said so Brandon doesn't get mad at me. It's just like it's licensing almost as a technical issue, not even as a philosophical or legal issue anymore, but it's just like the technical measures that are still in place there.
Right. All right, so before we have to wrap up, I want to get to this other question because I think it's pretty interesting, but Rick from the Smithsonian asked, you know, thinking about the challenge of assembling app user documentation, is there a thought to identify priority apps going end of life and archiving their websites before they disappear? And just to pile on to that, there's another question in the chat that asked, are we ever concerned about the persistence of this information on the web and how that might affect the longevity of the network or our ability to use the software that we've been configuring? Who wants to take a crack at it?
I mean, I don't have much to say.
Are we concerned? Yes.
Yes, I'm concerned, certainly. I mean, I do think this is one reason why it's very important that we, build strong ties to projects like the Wayback Machine as well, so that we can say, hey, because I mean, from my perspective, it seems rather unfeasible to have EaaSI itself start doing a separate archiving project. Maybe that is in the works, but if we have good channels of communication with other individuals that are doing web archiving, you can say, hey, oh, please make sure to save this resource. It's got a lot of good tips. And maybe if there was a kind of forum for where those of us working on EaaSI could kind of collect that important materials, that'd be good.
Yeah, this is Lauren. I'll just add, like, yes, concerned, and to add to Zach, I think the strong community ties as well. We kind of given shout outs to, the retro and gaming communities too, and the folks who have been doing this kind of work for a long time. I think that's another place to really continue to work on relationships, be part of that community, work with folks, share information, as well as the kind of web archiving. Because yeah, I mean, it'd be a lot to, kind of expect the EaaSI to kind of take that on. And this brings up interesting questions when thinking about the role of academic libraries, other organizations who are concerned with this. If we're talking about software, and I managed to catch some of the maintainers conference where I know that some of these discussions are being had. Well, what does that look like? The role of documentation around software, code, whether that's code, commercial software, whatever it is huge as far as preservation over time. So I'd be really interested in pursuing what that actually looks like to alleviate some of all of our concerns that we're clearly concerned about. Yeah.
And I do want to chime in terms from the EaaSI perspective that, I mean, yes, we are concerned about the persistence of this information. I think we would agree from our own scope of work perspective with the idea that like community outreach is going to be like the most efficient way of ensuring that persistence of this information long term. But we are also this discovery of like the need for a lot of consolidation and leveraging of online information has informed a lot of the user interface work that Portal has been doing, and our vision for the EaaSI platform in terms of the design and how, again, like we have lots of ideas now for like how help text or readme text that Lauren was talking about earlier, how once you find this information, whether it's on the live web or in a web archive, whatever platform that turns out to be, again, how do you link that to an EaaSI environment so it gets presented in the place that's like it's most useful for the end user? We are definitely thinking about that, and in that way, at least, as long as that information gets to our platform and we can continue working on the sustainability and persistence of the EaaSI platform itself, that information will continue.
And I would also point out that one of the fields that the student configuration workers are capturing is a link to, if they do any research or find documentation, they are recording those, where those are located on the web. And our semantic architect, Kat Thornton, who's doing a lot of work in publishing that information to Wikidata, or adding it to the Wikidata knowledge base. She herself has also been, or they have also been when finding documentation, whether that's a scan of a manual or an existing web version of that, including that as an item or a property in that item, so that we don't lose those connections to existing documentation. And that question of, especially for older applications of digitizing manuals has come up quite a bit, and so we've been discussing that as far as future efforts go, and subsequent rounds of funding. So yeah, something that we are keeping tabs on. And with that, it looks like we've run out of time, and I don't think we have any more time to address questions, but as always, if you have questions, feel free to email any of today's participants, or contact us through the website, but yeah, or hit us up on Twitter. We really appreciate everyone being here. Keep an eye out for a feedback survey that will be sent around to all of the attendees, and for the release of all 4 webinar recordings with transcripts and supplementary materials. We will hopefully have those up very soon on the EaaSI website. So thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, all.
Thanks, Seth.
Bye.